Welcome in to Inside Carolina's Next Level. I'm Tommy Ashley. That is the Greg Barnes, responsive by Johnny T-shirt and Congruity. We're going to talk money. Money, money, money makes the world go round. Certainly makes college athletics go round. Greg Barnes, you got the latest fiscal year 23-24 report from University of North Carolina. We'll talk about that in depth. Also, a couple other schools for relativeness purposes. But overall, when you got this document, I believe it's 90-page document. It details everything down to the brass tacks and paper clips, as we talk about. Overall thoughts on what you saw from this document that you received recently?
Well, I think the main thing is that North Carolina saw a massive influx of money yet again. It's pretty remarkable when you look back 10 years. North Carolina was at $83.8 million in 2014. And last year they reported 164.5 million. So that's a 96% increase in revenue over the past decade. And yet we've been talking for 2 years now, Tommy, about how there's this revenue gap brewing between the ACC and everybody else and the SEC and the Big Ten because of media money. And you say that it's about money now in college athletics, undoubtedly, for sure. And I think when you go through this report, in light of everything else that we know was taking place in the Division I landscape, I think you got to give North Carolina credit that they are attacking this the right way. They're generating money. They're spending money in spots where they need to be spending it. And they're trying to minimize that gap that exists. And as you said, we're going to take a look at another program in just a little bit to kind of expand on that some. But I think what this document shows, as well as what we know behind the scenes about how UNC is trying to approach rev share, assuming that the House settlement is approved in April, North Carolina is trying to do everything they can to stay above the that finish line, if you will, in terms of you don't want to get too far behind the chains, to use a football term. You want to make sure you're at least keeping up. And then if something opens down the line where maybe you can move to the SEC or to the Big Ten, then you're going to be in really good shape to be able to do that. But for now, you're just trying to tread water while maintaining and increasing revenues as best you can in hopes of keeping your athletic programs competitive on a national level.
Yeah, and we've seen, and just so folks understand, Carolina carries 28 varsity sports. It's 13 men's, 15 women's. We usually at Inside Carolina focus on basketball, football. We'll talk about women's basketball here and baseball as well, since the big four are there. But remember, when we talk these numbers, it also includes those other 24 programs that span the gamut. And to Greg's point, keep the athletic department going. Those are often many of the best programs in the nation, non-revenue Olympic sports, whatever you want to call them. We're going to focus on the big ones here today. Greg, let's talk about those media rights. You mentioned that, and it's the big talking point. We saw recently that ESPN has, I guess, picked up the option to carry it out to 2036. But Carolina, $33.8 million in media rights. And if I read it correctly, it breaks down to 26.2 or so for football and then 6.6 million for basketball. How does that compare to these other schools and these other conferences? And I mean, Carolina's turning a profit, so this is certainly helping here.
Yeah, and these numbers tend to keep going up. And when you look at the total distribution from the ACC, it's right about $42.5 million. That factors in some bowl game payout. And that's one area that's really going to help the ACC and North Carolina specifically in the years to come, because this document does not take into account the college football playoff expansion, which really kind of generates a lot more money for the Power Four conferences especially. And then if you can somehow get into the playoff, you're talking about a lot of money that you're going to be able to bring in. And so these numbers don't even include that. But as we know, the expectations are now that the SEC and the Big Ten have their media contracts in place. Um, while the ACC currently is about 20 million behind those conferences right now, that gap's only going to widen between now and the end of this decade. Some projections are that the SEC and the Big Ten will both be at $100 million in terms of per school distribution by 2030. The ACC maybe will get to 60 by that point in time, which is still about a $40 million differential. And that's just a big gap to try to make up. But what we see with these numbers is that the ACC is having success, slowly increasing those payouts. That's a good thing. But they need to continue to work and find a way to not only increase your media rights, and that's really key for the ACC, and with Florida State and Clemson and North Carolina and even Virginia, really kind of pushing the envelope of saying, look, we have to do more, and so therefore we have some of those unequal revenue share distributions that are being talked about, and some have already been in place within the ACC. There's more that has to be done in generating revenue, which comes through fundraising and corporate sponsorships and some of those other things that will be important with rev share as that comes.
Yeah, you talked about fundraising. Obviously, the Rams Club is the biggest fundraiser, for the biggest known fundraiser for North Carolina athletics, $27.7 million in fiscal year 23-24. 7 million of that football related, 1.1 of that basketball, and then women's soccer, 894,000. Which I think, if my math was correct, that was the third biggest. Greg, how does a lot of people talk about if I donate this or that, can I signify where it goes? Obviously, football getting the lion's share of the Rams Club money there, but your thoughts here on the Rams Club and their role in, I guess, the new era of college athletics that we've talked about so much. $27.7 million. It seems like a lot to me. I'd wonder how it compares to other, not to use a local school, but like Wolfpack Club and IPTAY and all those. But your thoughts on the Rams Club here for 27.7 mil?
Well, one thing I think we need to say first off is that when we start talking about what these booster clubs are able to raise, a big part of that is your alumni base, right? I mean, when you talk about a school, I don't know what Ohio State is now in terms of enrollment, but it's what, 60,000 people?
It's crazy.
3 times what North Carolina is. And so when you're having those many people come through your school and then graduate and move on and be a diehard fan, if you've got a 3-to-1 ratio there over years and years and decades and generations, well, you're going to have a lot more people to generate money from when you go out fundraising. And there's just a lot of smaller schools in the ACC, and that's part of the challenge. Now, the Rams Club has done just a fantastic job when you look at their athletic scholarship endowment, just over $500 million now, which is just a really remarkable effort that they've done. And really, with the Bill Belichick hire, the Rams Club got to work immediately after that was decided upon to really set things up and to kind of push the envelope moving forward so they can find ways to generate the money, not only to cover that, but really set up the program with rev share coming in, as well as the scholarship changes. There are going to be more kids on scholarship than there's ever been at North Carolina. So that's a big part of it as well. So I think those things are important. You asked about how money can be split among the programs. A couple of things here. Number one, it's just like what we've talked about with NIL, at least when there was the collectives. And even now with Carolina NIL being in-house, if you want to donate money, you can say, hey, I want to make this specific to football, specific to women's soccer, as you mentioned, or I'm just giving you money, use it however you see best. And some just want to use it for scholarships. So you can pick and choose however you want to do that. There's a lot of conversation. We can get into the numbers because we tend to always do about how football and men's basketball has to support the other 26 Olympic sports. That's the case at every program, across the country. But one thing that people need to understand is when you talk about baseball, for example, well, they operate at a loss every year. Every program that's not men's basketball and football operates at a loss. But because you have a strong fan base, strong alums within all these programs, they do a really good job of fundraising. And so I think women's soccer is a great example there. When you talk about a program that's able to raise close to $1 million annually, I don't know the exact number. I don't have in front of me of what women's soccer spent last year, but I feel comfortable in saying that it probably wasn't $1 million. And so that type of support is critical when we kind of project ahead about, and people say, oh, maybe you're going to have to cut sports. Well, a lot of these sports are pretty much self-sufficient when you factor in some of that fundraising. So that's the key part of it. And that's all kind of the same thing we're talking about with the Rams Club. You can call in and say, hey, I want my money to go specifically to this program. And that's the good thing about how the Rams Club is set up. You can pick and choose and support however you want to support.
Yep, absolutely. And to your point, $894,000 is a lot of money being donated to women's soccer, obviously, coming off the national championship. This year, I would assume that goes up. This report is from July of 23 to the end of June of 24, so it doesn't include that national championship there. Greg, another, we're talking about money coming in. Ticket sales, 31.5 or $31.2 million in revenue. I do find it interesting that football is 13.3 million of that. Basketball ticket sales, 15.6 million. Smaller arena. They do have more games, but basketball outpacing men's football or football in ticket sales and the other sports.
Let me say this real quick about that. Last year's football total was the most that they had sold, or 2 years ago, it was the most that they had sold since reducing capacity in Keenan. And so while this total from 2023-24 is a couple $100,000 less than that, it's still pretty close to where they should be. And this gets into the whole thing with Belichick, right? Of if you really ramp up the excitement and you increase the demand with a smaller stadium, guess what you can do? You can hike up
ticket
prices. And so that's part of it is you got to have a program that demands increased ticket prices if you want to have success. Fans don't want to hear that, but those things go hand in hand.
Yeah, it's you're going to have a 50,000 seat place, and if you're winning football games and you have a huge support and, excitement builds, you can expect higher ticket prices is how it works. I saw the other night in Cameron, I think, StubHub had tickets going for $1,400 to see that Duke Carolina basketball game. And if you want to pay that kind of money to see that ball game, what are you going to pay to see high-level football in Keenan Stadium? Talking with Greg Barnes here, talking about UNC Athletic Department Financial Report 23-24 coming in. Greg, of course, has got the column on Inside Carolina. If you haven't read that, this is sort of an accompaniment to that, the audio-visual side of the written word that Greg so eloquently puts together. Direct institutional support. $14 million in revenue or into the pot for North Carolina. Explain that to me and to us, because I don't recall that being a big thing over the last ever at Carolina.
Yeah, and I think this is the biggest. If you're looking for a reason to be excited and to feel optimistic about the future of North Carolina athletics, I think that is the one line item that should excite you, that should give you reason to think, okay, North Carolina is going to be okay. And I say that because Dick Bedore told me not long ago that for the longest time, the university really expected the athletic department to be self-sufficient. And that even when they would go to ask for increases in student fees to provide a little bit more money to the athletic department, that was a challenge. And a lot of times that got turned down. And if you go back, I've got these documents dating back 15 years now. And if you go back just 3 years ago, a big zero in that line item. And the year before, zero. And the year before, zero. But yet if you go to 2022-23, well, that line item was $5 million. And then, of course, this document now that we're talking about, 2023-24, is $14 million. And when we talk about direct institutional support, that is direct from the university. So that is, and COVID, I think, probably loosened up university leadership to saying, okay, look, athletic department was in bad situation because of how COVID affected, ticket sales and all those types of things. So there was a reason to help at that point in time, and so the university did. But now with rev share coming in, with the revenue gap, with conference alignment and media deals, as Lee Roberts said last week, I guess, at the faculty council meeting, athletics is the front porch to the university. And Dean Smith said that a long time ago before Lee did. But it's true. And there's countless examples of where athletics has really helped schools find success and generate excitement. I mean, Carolina had 60,000 applications this past year? I mean,
and it goes through the roof across the country when teams win national championships and have successful athletic seasons.
That's right. Jerry Moore talked about that a long time. When App State won 3 national titles in a row at the FCS level, even at that level, applications shot through the roof. So it's very important. And so I think we know that former Chancellor Kevin Guskowitz was an athletic supporter, and that he understood that things were changing. And Lee Roberts has a very good business mind, and he's kind of seeing the same things. And so I don't know that number will increase moving forward. I would suspect possibly it does, at least until things get settled down after rev share settled, provided that passes in April, or some form of it will down the line at least. And so I think that is a very significant notation in this document, that the university is finally embracing this idea of, hey, we've got to be able to support the athletic department, because that's such an important part of what this university provides to the community and to the fan base.
I'll be honest with you. I never thought I'd hear a chancellor say, when we see the North Carolina logo across the country and in other countries and all, they ain't wearing it because of the political science department.
Right.
I mean, that comment, as a guy that has been involved with Carolina for 50 plus years, that was an eye-opening comment. And to your point about the money and the financial support, if folks had any doubt, that's pretty good sign there for North Carolina athletics. And we see it in the investment, and this is another show altogether that we've done. You see it in the investment in the Belichick thing here. And so we will certainly talk about that for years to come about it. Greg, let's sort of flip it. Well, royalties, $14 million. That's, selling Carolina logo stuff, parking, concessions, $4 million. A lot of ways for North Carolina to bring in $164.5 million in revenue. Let me ask you this. Last year we talked about, I believe, Texas when we did this show. Have you had the opportunity to look at any other school and see what those revenues are for a school like Texas or a school like Ohio State or Kentucky? I'm probably catching you off guard, but I just remember Texas revenues last year were it would not have been a very supportive or a very good pie chart for North Carolina athletics comparatively.
Well, we know that Ohio State, they released theirs, and they're basically, their spending was $300 million, which is just insane. Let's see. So expenses were $292, and
expenses were $292.
Expenses. I think they spent a little bit more than that. They spent revenue was $254. So actually, they operated at a deficit. But I think Texas last year was at $280. I'm not sure what they are yet this year. So there's a significant gap there. And I think something we should go ahead and talk about, Tommy, is because we know North Carolina is in this unique position of being in a Power 4 conference, and we know that football now is king. There's no doubt about that. But yet Carolina basketball is arguably the top basketball program in the country. Duke's up there. Duke is private, so we don't have access to their documentation. However, Kentucky's up there as well. And so while we don't have the 2023-24 Kentucky financial report quite yet, I did go through their previous year report. And there's some interesting things that kind of shines a light on some of these challenges that UNC is facing currently and will continue to face. And that's why it's so important that university leadership and the Rams Club has been proactive in trying to address a lot of these issues before anything gets out of hand. And that's how you have to approach it, and that's what they've done. But if we look at the 2022-23 just total revenue, and I'm going to talk about basketball since that's the conversation with Kentucky. Total revenue for basketball programs, and this is according to Sportico, which has generated all this data, which is pretty good. They have a good resource for that, good database. Louisville actually brought in the most money in the nation, and this doesn't include some of the private schools like Duke, but they brought in $38.4 million in revenue, which is really good. Kentucky was number 2 at 32.1.
Let me stop you. Was this Louisville last year?
So this is 2022-23. So this is
is that when they were like one of the worst teams in the country?
Yes.
Okay.
So I imagine a lot of that was probably donations. But they also, Louisville does a good job with revenue because, I mean, they sold the rights for their, football stadium last year for $40 million. It's the Yum Center, so they have sponsorship there. So they've been willing to kind of push the envelope in terms of generating money. But Kentucky was 32.1. North Carolina was third at 31.7. So that's kind of what you would expect, although Louisville was a little bit ahead of everybody there. However, when you start looking at expenses for the basketball program that same year, Kentucky spent $23.6 million. Carolina spent $10.8 million out of what they brought in. So Kentucky, they basically saved or used for the rest of the department about $8 million. Carolina was about $21 million that they dispersed throughout the other parts of the athletic department. That's significant. And when you kind of get into the numbers of that, Kentucky, give them credit, they raised $6.5 million more in ticket sales than North Carolina did that year. But Carolina made up the difference. There was a $4.3 million in the royalty category, and Kentucky doesn't categorize their royalties and licensing in the same way. So that made up a big part of that difference. But really the key components, number one, Kentucky spent 3.8 on travel. North Carolina was 2.6. So that's significant. Kentucky did include some debt service of about $2 million in there. So that whittles it down some. Recruiting, Kentucky spent $1 million on recruiting costs. North Carolina was at $170,000. So significant there, $800,000 difference in recruiting expenses. And then the big one, of course, is coaching staff and support staff spending. Kentucky was at $12.6 million. North Carolina was at $4.6 million. So that's $8 million differential in coaching and support staff spending. That's a big number there. And you've got John Calipari, which plays a big role in that. And North Carolina hired somebody in Hubert Davis who had never been a head coach before. So you didn't have to pay at top level. But as I see reported in the fall, you've got an extension that was expected to be finalized for Hubert Davis coming off last year. So that's going to increase that total a little bit, but just a massive amount of spending differential within the programs. One thing I would say, well, a couple of things I'll say here. Number one, I mentioned the $4.6 million that Carolina spent in 2022-23 in coaching and support staff for the basketball program. Well, that jumped up significantly this past year, about 25% to $5.8 million. So that's moving in the right direction. That's pretty solid. But the two numbers that I think are most important when we're talking about this Kentucky differential. Kentucky raised $175 million 2 years ago in revenue. At that point in time, Carolina was at $139 million. So that's a $35 million difference. Where did that come from? I'll tell you where. So contribution-wise, Kentucky raised $38 million. North Carolina's $21 million that year. So that's $17 million. And then media rights. because Kentucky, of course, is in the SEC. Their media rights deal paid them $56.7 million. North Carolina's that year was $33.3 million. That's $23.4 million differential in media rights deal. So combined media rights and contributions, you got $40 million. The difference in total revenue between the programs, again, was roughly $35.5 million. So that's pretty much it. That's where your media rights money is so important, as well as being able to generate fundraising. But that's it. I mean, we've talked about this for years, Tommy, but I think that's a great example of the gap between a program like Kentucky and a program like North Carolina, and how athletic department officials and university officials are trying to attack this from multiple angles to make sure North Carolina is in position to be competitive.
Yeah, it's amazing the difference, the recruiting budgets. And granted, your number for Carolina was 170. That was last year. This past fiscal year, I think it bumped up to 205. But still, Kentucky's spending $1 million in recruiting in basketball, men's basketball alone. Let's look at that. Let's look at some of these expenses for North Carolina. Scholarships, $16.2 million. Obviously, scholarships and all that's going to change significantly here when the new way of doing things takes shape. Coaching salaries for Carolina across the athletic department, $30.8 million. Support staff, $27.2 million. Greg, that's explain to me, and you told me off the air, but explain to me here on air, $27.2 million in support staff for these teams. It just seems like a lot. What am I missing?
It is a lot, but look, what have we been talking about on the message board for the past 2 weeks? General manager, right? Where does that money come from? That's support staff. So the support staff and administration, that's essentially everybody that's not either a head coach or an assistant coach. That's strength and conditioning. That's secretaries. That's your analytics squad. That's trainers. That's all of your athletic department administrators. So associate ADs and Bubba and that whole group. There's a lot of people that work within the athletic department in North Carolina. And when you have 28 sports, that's required. And so, yes, it's a massive cost, but at the same time, I don't think there's probably any coach who says, you know what, I've probably got too many people helping me out.
Yeah.
And that's one thing we've talked about. Marcus Page has come on for the basketball program. We know that there's going to be a general manager hired for the basketball program coming up. There's probably other roles. We don't know exactly what Bill Belichick's staff's going to look like. We know there's going to be a massive increase in spending on the football staff. So these numbers are only going to increase in the years to come, Tommy.
All right. I'm going to put you on the spot. And I mentioned it before we started. Direct overhead and administrative expenses. Carolina spent $20 million fiscal year 23-24 on whatever that line item is. What is that line item? Because it feels like a lot of pigs and blankets and pork bellies running around in Chapel Hill to spend $20 million on that. Is that fair? Probably not.
I mean, I would assume so. And I imagine there's audits that take place just to make sure the money's being used. But there's a lot of copies that have to be made. And there's a lot of staplers. But look, there's I don't have the number in front of me, but there is a ton of people that work at that athletic department. I mean, just a ton. And when you've got all these, I mean, it's just like running a massive office. And those costs increase every year. And it's a big number. And I wish I had a list of what all that was. But I can imagine that it's very boring stuff that you're like, oh, okay, yeah, they do need that. Oh, okay. They do need computers, right? They do need paper. They do need pens. They need desks occasionally. They need video equipment. I mean, there's a lot of that type of stuff that kind of folds into this.
Yeah, and it's a big business, folks. And if you get hold of these financial reports, you see some things that are just it is unbelievable. Student athlete meals, $3 million plus. I mean, that's part of having a massive athletic department where you've got You've got 28 sports. A couple other numbers looking at the expenses. This is another one of those numbers that I was blown away by. We won't go into it too much, but non-team travel and banquets, $7.1 million expense. Facilities, 5.3. There's a lot that goes into that. Game day expenses, 8.6 million. Travel for all these teams, 12.9 million. It's just, but Greg, I think the one that sticks out for me, um, and I harped on this last year, and this is just the nature of the beast, is still the recruiting numbers. 1.6 million in recruiting for football, 205,000 for men's basketball, women's basketball recruiting, $322,000. Granted, they're very good this year, so that money's paying dividends. What about the expenses that we haven't talked about kind of stood out to you before we get to sort of the comparison between money brought in, money spent for the big four programs?
Well, I think you've hit on a lot of key things, and it really gets down to what is it that makes a program successful. If you don't have, if you need to go recruit and you don't have the funds to pay for recruiting, that's problematic. If there's a key role on your staff where there's a hole, that's a problem. And so that's really what Bubba and his staff have to do, and you have to have those communications within the, with the various programs of, okay, what exactly is it that you need to be successful, and that's where the energies have to be focused. It would be interesting to hear what exactly needs to be spent for men's basketball to get them to where they need to be. There's a lot of talk of, Carolina doesn't spend anywhere near what Kentucky does. And that's true. However, when we talk about the extra money coming with an extension for Hubert Davis, provided that plays out the way that we expect it to, that's going to bump that part of it up. So what else is it? I know a lot of people have talked about, when Alabama was here, they had this whole staff underneath where they were working on analytics and they were studying film, and then they come back to Nate Oates and tell them exactly what was going on. Why didn't Carolina have that? Well, is that something that's been requested? I don't know that, but it's a good question. And what we do know is that when Kirby Smart got to Georgia, he did not have the infrastructure that Nick Saban had when he was at Alabama. And so what did Kirby do? Kirby said, well, we've got to have something like this. So he rounded up a bunch of students who worked free of charge as interns because they got access to the football program. And they ran around and did a lot of this random stuff. They had kids in college doing scouting for him because it was something that had to be done. And he was willing to take free work and you have to work through a little bit of messy product instead of not having it at all. And so there are different ways of kind of getting around some of these things. So it's really just a matter of kind of whittling down and saying, okay, this is required. This is what we have to have. And that gets down to a very granular level. And you would think that's kind of been done or is being done. And that's going to change even more as we move into rev share and those types of things. So hopefully those conversations are taking place. I imagine that they are.
Yeah, we've seen the investment that they're making in football. I think they need to make a similar investment in basketball. Whether you believe it's Hubert Davis or that's neither here nor there. But when you look at football revenue, so football revenue 67, football expenses 40, so 27 million in profit there, if you want to call it profit. Basketball 32.1, as you outlined, expenses 13.4. Women's revenue 1.4 million. Expenses 5.2 million. So there's a big deficit. Baseball is 2.8, and then expenses is 4.9. Greg, the bottom line is it's a big business. It's a big dollar business. Money needs to be well spent, but money needs to be spent. The key to success is finding out where to spend it in the correct places, like you talked about, and not wasting it. How does all this change if this house settlement comes through like it's supposed to, and the scholarship numbers increase, and just all of that? It just seems like these numbers are going to balloon, at least on the expense side. They're going to have to balloon on the revenue side for schools like North Carolina and the ACC to stay solvent, right?
I think it's probably a safe ballpark to say if the settlement goes through as expected, and with the scholarship changes, because I don't think that's been talked about enough in terms of what that's going to do. Because as I said in my column, North Carolina reported 864 student athletes, unique student athletes. Some of those play different sports for 2023-24. When you start looking at some of the numbers for the roster limits, I mean, there's probably going to be a couple hundred off that number, right? So you're going to see a massive reduction in the actual body count. But North Carolina is going to do what it can to really take advantage of the opportunity to fund scholarships for all roster spots, which has never been done before. Well, now you're talking about, if there's 600 student athletes, I think Carolina only funded maybe 350 or so this past year. So that's a massive amount of money that you have to provide, in addition to that 20.5 to 22 million that's expected with rev share. So just tack on another 30 to the expenses, which tells you, SMU and Clemson this past year, because they made the college football playoff, well, they got a $4 million check. Even though they both got embarrassed in the first round, they got paid $4 million for it, and they get that money. If they had gotten to the finals, $20 million. So think about that. If you make the finals of the CFP, you basically cover your rev share payout for that year. So that's why you roll the dice and go after somebody like Bill Belichick to see if it will work. And at the end of the day, Tommy, we're talking about Kentucky. When you look at some of these numbers that you just kind of rolled off, I think a key part of it is when you look at the surplus, so the profit, we'll call it profit. For football in 2023-24, football's profit was $26.8 million. Basketball was 18.6. And so instead of investing all that money back into those programs, that's dispersed across the athletic department, both in terms of some of these administrative costs, paying other people that aren't coaches within the football and basketball programs, as well as the 26 other sports. If we back up a year to where we're talking about Kentucky 2022-23, Kentucky, their excess in men's basketball and football was $19 million. Carolina's that year was $43 million. So that's a $24 million difference. If you go back to the media rights conversation, the difference between Kentucky and North Carolina that year was $23.4 million. So $24 million compared to $23.4. So the difference there is that revenue gap with conference payouts. We've been harping on it for years. We will continue to harp on it because it's continued to be an issue. And so moving forward, it's really a matter of what can North Carolina do to maximize revenue while they're trying to get the ACC to play along and maybe try to find a way out of the grant of rights sometime in the near future. And that's what this is all about. And so, as I said earlier, just in talking with people around the program, I think everybody is on board in understanding what's coming and the difficulty in it. And so there's a robust effort to increase revenue for the athletic department this year, next year, the years to come, to try to minimize whatever financial damage is coming with the media gap in terms of those contracts. And so I think that's the key part. Carolina's doing what they can, but there's still a big hole they're trying to avoid.
Yeah. And that's why we talk about the financials all the time, because like I started the show with, it's all about the money in college athletics. We've seen it explode over the years. And for the most part, Greg, the teams with the most money are the ones that are winning, especially on the football side.
Yep.
And that's why North Carolina needs to get in the game, continues to get in the game. That's why the ACC needs to step it up as much as possible. Anything left, Greg, before we get out of here?
No, what you just said there, it's not, you're not guaranteed success if you spend the most money, but to have success, you have to have the money. And Bubba has talked about in the past that Carolina hasn't had to have the most money because they've done a good job with hires, and he's right. I mean, North Carolina's been stellar in terms of what they've been able to do on the fields of play. The concern is you can say that when there's a $10 million gap, but when we get to like a $30 million gap or maybe even a $40 million gap, I don't know if that's true anymore. And then the other thing, you mentioned Hubert Davis. That's going to be it's already a hot topic. It will continue to be a hot topic into the offseason. But really, what the administration has to decide is, does Hubert have right now what he needs to succeed? And if he doesn't, you have to get that for him. Now, you may decide, okay, well, we don't think he's going to be the guy, and so it makes the conversation easier. But you still have to have everything in place for the next guy if you decide to go that route. But if Hubert doesn't have what he needs right now, and I'm not talking about NIL. That's a little bit different. I'm talking about in terms of staff structure and what he needs, with video help and data analytics, all this stuff. If those things are not in place, well, that has to be addressed like now, right now. And those are the types of things when you start talking about, maybe making the move to go to a different coach, you got to make sure all that stuff is buttoned up. Because if a top level coach comes in and says, there's too much stuff that I need, like this is a mess, you may not get those individuals. And so hopefully those conversations are taking place. It sounds like with the general manager situation, that's something that Bubba's been harping on for a while. So hopefully that gets resolved sooner than later, and that will help Hubert, especially in the weeks to come as the transfer portal opens up and the offseason arrives.
That is Greg Barnes talking financials. Check out Congruity, Matt at congruityhr.com for your financial needs for your small to mid-sized business. Darren and Matt, they'll handle all this stuff that we're talking about. They'll handle it for you for your small to mid-sized business. Also, Johnny T-Shirt and JohnnyT-Shirt.com, sponsors of the show as well. It's been next level. Talking about UNC Athletic Department Financial Report, fiscal year 23-24. Got to spend money to make money. You got to spend money to win games these days. That's Greg Barnes. I'm Tommy Ashley. It's been next level. We'll talk to you soon.